This is Jason Wagner from Wagner Oehler Law Firm. Today we're going to be talking about a client success story. So when we're doing the estate planning, of course, it's all thinking about what happens when a person dies. But when that person does die, there's some steps we need to take to ensure that the estate plan is operating the way it's supposed to, and we can also take advantage of some post-mortem estate planning strategies. These are strategies we can employ when a person has died to further maximize the estate tax savings. So we had a client that had a fair amount of farmland between him and his wife. And, the inevitable happens, dad dies. Well, the estate plan is already set up. They were thinking ahead. They had their trusts going. We funded those trusts with various assets, including real estate. So in Minnesota, we have a $3 million exemption limit that allowed us to fund the credit shelter trust with the first $3 million of assets. That's tax-free. Then we have in Minnesota what's called a family farmland deduction. And they had enough farmland that we were able to fund that credit shelter trust with an additional $2 million of farmland. That is the maximum amount of the family farmland deduction. In order to qualify for that deduction, the person that died had to have owned the land for at least 3 years prior to death. The land has to be ag homestead in the year of death. It must pass to a qualified heir, which in this case, our revocable trust became the irrevocable trust, with the primary beneficiary being the spouse, so it qualifies. And then the qualified heir must agree that they will not sell the land outside of the family for at least 3 years after death. For most families, that's a very low bar to meet. Usually that's just what they plan to do anyways, but we have to make sure that we are proactively taking that deduction on the estate tax return that is timely filed within 9 months after death, in order to make sure that we're taking advantage of that. So now we have $5 million of assets that we were able to move into a credit shelter trust at the death of the first spouse. And that's all Minnesota estate tax free. It's also federal estate tax free because the federal estate tax limits are over 12 million. And this was in 2022. So certainly we're protected there. Now we move over to mom's side, right? Well, what do we have left? We still have a significant amount of farmland and other assets. So now we know that if everything goes according to plan, when the second spouse dies, we are able to take advantage of that full 3 million again, the family farmland deduction again. So we're able to save an additional $5 million of assets from estate tax exposure from both the Minnesota and the federal estate tax limits. But we're also thinking, we're pretty confident that mom's fairly healthy. So we decided to do a gift, right? So let's say we do a $3 million gift from mom to the kids, and Minnesota does not have a gift tax. So that is a gift tax free. Minnesota does have a 3-year look back if a person dies within 3 years of making a gift. So that's certainly a concern. But what we did was made sure that the assets that were being gifted were had a higher basis, which means that we can eliminate that concern that we want to hold on to these assets until mom's death so she can get a stepped up basis. And that's something I'll talk about in some other videos. But now we've got this gift. We've got $3 million moved out from a gift. As long as mom lives at least 3 years, that's never coming back into the Minnesota estate. We moved $5 million out at dad's death, so we're up to $8 million. And then we've got in mom's estate, we know that she'll get the $3 million from Minnesota, plus the additional $2 million from the family farmland deduction. So that leaves us with $13 million of assets that we're able to protect 100% estate tax free, as long as we're fitting it into the right buckets, making the right elections, and making sure that we're planning ahead, which all of this occurred in this estate plan. So that's a significant savings. Minnesota's estate tax rate brackets range from 13% to 16% once you start paying estate tax. So you can do that math and see that it's some pretty significant tax savings. In addition to that, we have our federal estate tax. As I mentioned, 12 million per person, right? Well, we know when dad died, we used up 5 million of that. So we're left with 7. But mom still has her 12. Okay, great. Now we can do portability election, which we did in the federal estate tax return, to make sure that dad's remaining 7 million goes over to mom. Now she has 19 million. Well, what if the exemption limits roll back down in 2026? What if Congress doesn't extend it? Well, we still have our 7 million. And even if they do roll back down, it's going to be based off of the permanent exemption amounts of 5 million per person, which is adjusted for inflation. So we expect that to be significantly higher, 6, maybe 7 million. So we still have somewhere between 12 and 14 million dollars of federal estate tax exemption available for mom to use at her death, which we feel very comfortable we're not going to have an issue with federal estate taxes. And that's a pretty big deal, because the federal estate tax rates are 40% of the amount that goes over the exemption limit. If we had not made that portability election, mom would be left with her 12 million. But if that's going to cut back down, if Congress doesn't act, now she's only left with her $5 to $6 million exemption limit, and we would be back into the territory of paying federal estate tax at a 40% rate. In addition to, what if we hadn't done the rest of it with Minnesota? So all in all, this estate plan saved the family a significant amount of taxes because they planned ahead, because they made timely elections, because they met with a qualified estate planning attorney, and because they were willing to do the planning. So it's really important that when you're doing the estate planning, that you're working with somebody that understands all of these elections, and that you start the process before you really need to enact it, which really gives us the tools to do this post-mortem estate planning to make sure everything lands in the right bucket. For more information, you can follow our videos on YouTube or check out our website at www.wagnerlegalmn.com.